Alrighty, welcome to our next session with Wolfgang Gorlick. He's an advisory chief information security officer with Duo Security. Previously, Wolfgang was with the CBI, where he built and led a cybersecurity apprenticeship, which launched the careers of 67 professionals. Right now, he's focused on the local cybersecurity community and playing an early role in many groups and conferences, including MySec. And with that, passing off to Wolf, who will be talking with entitled "We Got It Wrong."
Yes, we did. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to all you guys for joining. I hope you're having a great conference. I want to start with a story. Recently, I was in New York. There's a building called the Citigroup Center. It's on Lexington Ave, and it's a really interesting building. It's one of the tallest buildings in New York. As a matter of fact, when it was built, it was the 7th tallest building in the world. There it is on the New York skyline, that lovely New York skyline. Now, this building is really funky, though. It's very weird. There's a lot of requirements to protect property beneath. And what that meant was they actually built this building on stilts, okay? This 7th tallest building in the world is built on stilts. It looks something like this. You can see they're not even in the corners. And the architect, his name was Hugh Stubbins. The architect designs this building, runs the math, makes sure that if the winds, hit the face of the building, it doesn't blow over, finishes it, the building goes up, tens of thousands of people move in, and then he gets a call. He gets a call from an architectural student, a student named Diane Hartley. She gives a call to Stubbins and his firm because she's doing her thesis on this building. It's a weird building. And she's trying to check the math. And she's like, this doesn't seem right. It seems like the building should fall over. And, maybe it will, maybe it won't. They take her information, they run the numbers internally, and they freak out. They hadn't considered the wind hitting the corners of this building. If the wind hits the corners of the building, it wouldn't stand up. As a matter of fact, they did the math, and it was a 1 in 16 chance of it toppling, 1 in 16 chance of it falling over, 1 in 16 chance of it killing tens of thousands of people, and in New York, doing this sort of domino effect as it crushes things. Why did they get it wrong? They got it wrong because traditionally, your corners are your strongest part of the building. But a student, someone with fresh eyes, went, you know what? That's not the case here. And when we check into it, it doesn't stand. I bring the story up because this is the frame I want to go into this conversation with. It's so important in our discipline, the discipline of cybersecurity, that we challenge each other, we challenge assumptions. There's someone on this call, it's a student, it's someone breaking into the industry that is going to see something that I don't, that's going to see something that people who've been doing this for years and decades haven't. So keep that in mind. Bring that energy to this talk. My name, as already mentioned, is Wolf Gorlick. I fight for the user. Sounds cooler than it is, but I'm sticking to it. And today what we're going to do is we're going to build our own building. We're going to build a thing. We're going to build a thing, and we're going to do it following a life cycle. The life cycle you see in front of you is actually Microsoft's secure development life cycle. I'm going to follow these sort of steps broadly. I'm going to talk to you about requirements. I'm going to talk to you about design. We're going to implement it. We're going to verify it. We're going to put users on it. And along the way, I'm going to point out where the corners are. I'm going to point out where we say things in cybersecurity that kind of work, but can lead to misunderstandings and can lead to problems. And hopefully, in doing that, it'll give you an idea of where you can add, where you can contribute, and what landmines that you can avoid. So let's start with building the thing. Let's start with talking about requirements, right? We're going to do requirements. We are going to figure out what the thing should have, how the thing should be built, how tall it should be, what the features are, what we're going to allow folks to do, and importantly, for the conversation of us, we're going to be setting security requirements. And this is where you hear something like, we manage risk. The job of cybersecurity is to manage risk. I had a vendor, cybersecurity vendor, when I was responsible for security at a financial services firm. And they actually scrubbed their whole site and changed every word of security to manages IT risk. Sounds very impressive. However, it doesn't often work that way. You know, the reason why we got into managing risk is because we went into secure IT and we went, this is awesome. I can deep dive in this. I can figure out so many things. Did you know that we can reverse engineer this binary? Did you know that you can use a SQL injection to get through this website? Did you? And we got very technical very fast. And then we tried to explain that to the business. And we said, you need to patch this because there's a SQL injection flaw. We need to not roll out this technology because people can get into it, which left them confused and angry. Really, this is the default state of many business people when talking to security. So I go, we're not getting the buy-in, we're not getting things done. What are we going to do? How are we going to fix this? And collectively, we all thought about it. We went, you know what? The business is in the business of taking risks. The business keeps talking about risks. Aha! We will learn risk. And then we went and learned risk. And we got way technical and left them confused and angry. I'm looking at you, fair people. I'm looking at you, active people. Anytime you went from going, you know, there's a risk here that we need to address, to going, here is the Monte Carlo simulation. And it clearly dictates, by the way, sometimes I slip up and say Monty Python simulation, which probably sounds about the same to a CFO, if we're being honest. Whenever we get to that, we don't actually talk a language that gets folks to do things. So we end up with what I call cheeseburger risk management. This is one of the first things we get wrong. And I call it cheeseburger risk management because it's no surprise risk doesn't work. It doesn't work for driving. It doesn't work for saving money. We've got an entire year pandemic to show how risk doesn't work. And it doesn't work for diet and exercise. If you tell people that eating cheeseburgers is bad, they'll go, yes. If you say there's a risk that cheeseburgers will kill you, they'll go, yes. And then the minute you leave, they're going to order a cheeseburger because cheeseburgers are tasty. As a matter of fact, I may have one for dinner. And then eventually the cheeseburgers will catch up and they'll have a heart attack. And you're standing there going, security risk manager told you that cheeseburgers are bad. See what happened to you? And they'll go, you're right. And they'll change their ways for maybe a year or two, and they'll go back to eating cheeseburgers. This is what happens with risk management. This is why risk management is actually a terrible way to communicate to the business what has to happen. Another thing you hear about in terms of requirements is don't check the box. I hate checkbox security. We are going to stop checkbox security. The apprenticeship that was mentioned earlier at CBI, I would always have so much fun with people coming out of cybersecurity programs because they'd be like, we've got to fill out the CIS controls and meet them. I'm like, yes. And then we do an assessment and they come back and go, that business is only doing like 2 of them. I'm like, yes, you're right. Because if you stop and think about how many compliance obligations, requirements, regulations, how many boxes there are to check, you quickly realize there's way more than we can ever do. As a matter of fact, at one point in time in my career, I was very ambitious. At one point in time in my career, I went, you know what, I'm going to take the CIS benchmarks and I'm going to apply them to every piece of device. I'm going to spend time with each device. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to secure it. I'm going to make it hard. I'm not just going to check the box. And I burned myself out. And in doing so, I did the math and I figured, you know, there's probably 1 of me to 5,000 devices. So how much, I don't need PTO. I can probably work 12 hours a day. How much time does that give me with device? And it actually only gave me about an hour for each piece of equipment to secure it. Really not enough time. So when people say, oh, don't check the box, blah, 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 I would encourage you to think about the following. If you were to create a grid between what matters to the business on top and what doesn't really matter, what matters to the adversary left to right, and what doesn't matter on the left. If it doesn't matter to the business really, and it doesn't matter to a criminal, in other words, a criminal's not going to make money stealing you from you doing this, right? I'm going to check that box. I'm going to check that box so hard. I am going to check that box like no one checked the box. And then you know what? I'm going to move on to things that are important. Now, maybe in those other grids, I may check the box. I may spend time with them. I don't know. But I'm going to spend most of my time up there where it matters to criminals, where they're highly motivated to steal from us, up there where it matters to the business, where we're highly motivated to protect it. That's where I'm going to spend my time. I'm going to check the box everywhere else. And if you're wondering, when I say I fight for the users, this is a screenshot from my desk. I mean, glowing screens, locks everywhere. It's great. Highly recommend being a CISO, kids. No. The next thing you're going to hear is compliance doesn't equal security. Yeah, duh. I think we covered that. Compliance gives us a list of all the things we could do. It's our role as security professionals, as the defense, the people in the blue team, to figure out what we should do. And those are completely different things. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of things that we should do that aren't even on compliance checklists, which gets to my other favorite one, which is where people tell me, well, if I'm secure, it'll make us compliant. I had an executive who said that once. And I'm like, have you tried saying that out loud and just listening to yourself? I mean, those, we've already decided those are two different things. Why are we mixing them up again? Ugh. So think about that when we're setting requirements. There are things we're going to have to do, but there's no shame in doing things minimally so that we can focus in on what really matters. Now, the next thing you may see, and you probably saw this meme I'm about to show, or a variant of it, is security should measure and improve maturity. And so there's a great graphic on this. Maybe you've seen it, maybe you haven't, that shows the CMM, right? The capability maturity model, all the way from very immature, initial level 1 to optimize where you're the hero. And I love this. And I see this, I'm like, yeah, that's me. Frontline defense. Yes. And I started thinking about it a little bit further. So how does it cost to do these things? Well, we're going to assume that a stick and a bone, our caveman guy, there's some sweat equity there. He's got some skill with that stick, I'm sure, but it doesn't cost that much. I could walk out in the park behind and find a stick. I might be able to find a bone, but if I do, that's a whole nother story. Vikings, our Viking sword and shield and helmet, you can probably get good reenactment battle quality versions for around $500. Spend more if you want, but that's available to you. Last century, the cost to equip a US soldier was around $1,100. So you can see the difference between level 2 and level 3 automatic. We've doubled the cost to get a little bit more security, go from repeatable to defined, whatever the hell defined means. And so you start to get an idea, but it really gets exciting when you get to the cost of equipping a soldier in the 21st century, which is around $17,500. So you're starting to wonder, do I really need to be managed? Or can I just be defined? But if you're like me, you still want that Iron Man suit, right? So think about this. Start adding zeros. Keep adding zeros. The Mark 7 suit of Iron Man, the one that's displayed here, cost around $1.5 billion. And yet this is what we're aiming for? I don't know if that makes sense. Don't get me wrong. Never say no to an Iron Man suit. There's nothing else you walk away from this talk. Please walk away with that. Never say no to Iron Man suit. If there is a CEO or CFO that says, we're going to give you $1.5 million, you say, yes, thank you, and you build the best security program of the world. The reality is we're probably going to have a number of capabilities while we're defining the requirements. And some of them are going to be very immature. And that's on purpose because we only have so many resources to spread, right? Some of them may be pretty good. Some of them may be rocking, like our network controls are pretty good in this example. Our identity controls, identity is a new perimeter. We're going to spend some there. But to do that, we have to make choices. And strategy and security is all about making choices. So when it comes to requirements, use compliant checklists as examples of what we could do, then ruthlessly prioritize what we should do. And remember that good security uses risk to prioritize, not to communicate. Talking about risk, if anything we've learned out of the pandemic, does not necessarily change behavior, does not necessarily get the buy-in we think it does. All right. Next round where we get it wrong is design. So if you think about that life cycle, right? Start with your set of requirements. Talk through how to do those, looking at different ways to put those together. Now we go to design. We're going to design the security system for the thing we're building. Now, when we do that, one of the first things people tell you is use a design process. And I think that's smart. I think it's wise to use a formal process to design things. I think where we get it wrong is some of the ways we interpret the processes. One of the ways you guys probably have have seen or experienced is ITIL. So ITIL is a service design process, and it's very extensive, right? We're going to think about our service catalog, our service level agreements, how long we have to be up and down. We're going to think about our capacity. What about availability and high availability? What happens if we need continuity and recovery? Thankfully, security is in there. Supply chain is in there. Even more important now with solar winds and these attacks we're seeing very frequently on supply chain, where adversaries break into other organizations, other software vendors, and use those as pivots into high security lockdown environments. Awesome. You guys notice what's not here, though? You notice what's missing? Where's the people? Where's the person we're building for? Where's the workforce? Where's the customer? It's not even listed. It's not even an ITIL consideration at this point. You may argue there's the 4P in ITIL, which does include the mention of people, bonus points, but oftentimes that isn't the way IT is designed. So one of the reasons why I actually like design thinking, if you haven't had a chance to, I'd encourage you to look into design thinking. It starts with empathy. It starts with the person. It starts with thinking about how people are going to use these controls we provide. Oftentimes overlooked in the design process, something we get wrong all the time. And what happens when we get wrong is the conversation goes something like this, right? You can imagine a software development firm and your job is to secure it. And you hear one of the developers go, you know, before the sprint planning, I'm going to take a walk around outside, I'm going to stretch my legs, spring, get some fresh air. And a teammate may say, hey, isn't it supposed to rain? You know, you should be careful. And that's the moment where security man jumps in, right? I've got this. I've got you covered. We don't want you to get wet. And we also don't want you to get hurt. And, you know, people can drop stuff off roofs. I saw this on Krebs where they're talking about someone dropped something off a roof. And wasn't there a podcast recently where they talked about like exploits that were coming in from this? And so next thing you know, this lovely developer who just wants to give a walk around the building is given something like this from security. Here's your security control. Carry this with you always. You will not get hurt. You will not get wet. Life is good. By the way, shout out to The Uncomfortable for this design. This is actually a real design that they've got on their website. I love The Uncomfortable. Great examples of products that honestly remind me of really bad security. But this is the approach we take. I was having a conversation earlier with some folks in the Hangouts, and they're talking about, well, we need to log in a multi-factor to do a form, then we need to log in multi-factor that we've done the form, we log in multi-factor. There's like 7 different steps to complete this process. And you just want to pull your hair out. You know, it's the umbrella out of concrete. To get around that, to fix this problem, we really need to have a better understanding of the business subject matter expert. Now, that could be someone in accounting, that could be our developer I just mentioned, that could be someone in IT, someone who is the subject matter expert for their area. In security, we've got our ideas. We've got our set of requirements. Bridging the gap is incredibly important. And to do that, we need a security advocacy program and a champion program. A lot of people don't have these. A lot of people don't even consider them. Some may consider a champion, but it's rare. And so what is the role of the champion? The role of the champion is someone within the business unit who speaks for the business to say, that umbrella is too heavy. And their role is to speak to the business to say, but we don't want anything to fall on you, right? The security champion is within the business unit and cares about security. The advocate is advocating to the champion, keeping them informed of things, keeping abreast, but also advocating back to us, the subject matter experts, who are designing things to say, really, Wolf? Did you really think that was a good idea? Have you tried what you're proposing? Right? The goal of the advocate and the champion is to collaborate to make sure the security controls are actually effective. So to have empathy at scale, we need to have a good advocacy program and we need to have a good champion program. The next thing I want to talk about is, all right, we're still in the design process. We're going to secure it like a castle. that's almost like our go-to, right? In security, we love our castles. We're going to secure a perimeter like a castle. We're going to secure a web server like a castle. We're going to secure a Hadoop cluster like a castle. This comes up again and again. It's a great metaphor, I guess. It's something we like to talk about. It can help explain when we're getting in defense in depth concepts. However, is a castle really a good metaphor? Is a castle really a good idea for this? Yes, the question reminds me of military grade. Yes. Yes. Thank you. You're absolutely right. It's just like design like a castle. Military grade security should be just fine. This is Harlequin Castle. It's one of the quintessential castles in Europe. I was fortunate enough to visit it. And what was fascinating about it is a couple different things. One, it took 20 to 30 years to get most of it in place. It also took around 20% of the revenue of the kingdom. By contrast, IT generally spends 3.2% of the revenue of the business. Security gets a small sliver of that. If you can go to someone and say, look, boss man, I want to spend 20% of all the money we make securing this place. And that works. Also, at that point, ask for an Iron Man suit. Just keep going. You're golden. The reality is that we very rarely have the resources it takes to build a castle, nor do we have the time. And this is not overly surprising, right? We don't build castles anymore. They were very popular for a couple centuries. They cost a kingdom's worth of wealth. They took decades to make. Hopefully, by the time they're done, what they were protecting was still important. When the adversaries were changing over the time span of centuries, building security over this time span of decades made sense. When the adversaries started changing in the time span of months to years, suddenly waiting decades to have security didn't make sense. Cavalry, gunpowder, these were the things that killed security, or castles. So what did you do, right? If you were trying to defend your kingdom and you could no longer build a castle, what are you going to do? What they did was they moved to securing the roads. And I'd argue that's exactly what we need to do as a metaphor. We need to think about security as a path. Security is a path, or rather the activities are a path, and security is something we're building along that path. How do you figure out that path? Well, from an adversary perspective, you're going to be using threat modeling. How will the adversary move through our environment? What do those steps look like? What are their tactics and procedures? What kind of security do we need to put in place? From a user perspective, the path is going to be defined by workflow mapping or journey mapping, some of these UI, UX concepts. And again, it's like, how do we deposit money? How do we sell things? How do we deliver services? Those paths are where we need to put security. And then along that path, making it as simple as possible so we're not adding friction. Now, I mentioned threat modeling, and you may think, oh yeah, awesome, threat modeling. But then you're thinking, well, wait a minute, nobody's got time for that, right? Nobody's got time for threat modeling. We've been talking about threat modeling for years, and very few people do it, which is incredibly frustrating to me. I think there's a reason, and this reason may sound familiar, right? We got into secure IT, and we made it technical. Look at this bits and bytes, look how we can do a memory exploit, and people got understandably confused and angry. So we thought, we'll get into threat modeling. And what do we do with threat modeling? We make it overly technical. We may have a problem, by the way. And these threat models have then left people confused and angry. If you go and you give a developer a threat tree that took weeks to make, this is not going to convince them to put the right controls in the path. Security folks have a bad tendency to overcomplicate everything. And so if you're taking threat modeling and you're making a threat model that takes weeks to build, but your code is going into production daily, we're never going to catch up, and we're never going to influence change. It's incredibly important to make simple threat models. Now, I'm not saying a threat tree isn't valid and there isn't places for it, but I'm saying that we need to scale up or scale down as appropriate, because threat modeling is so valuable and no one's doing it because it seems really complicated and messy. If you want to know how to do threat modeling right, I would encourage you to check out the threat modeling manifesto. I wish I was involved with this. I was involved early days with attack paths and those types of threat modeling. I was not involved with this one, but the values speak to me so much. They want to create a culture of finding and fixing design issues at the core. They want to focus in on people and collaboration. I think security is a team sport. It's a people sport. Makes perfect sense to me. I'm not one for heavy processes and methodologies. They want to view threat modeling as a journey of understanding. We're going to do a series of these and get better, and better at understanding the path people are taking so we know where to put the controls. They want to talk about threat models? No, we want to do threat models. And again, that makes sense because I've been talking about threat modeling way too long, way too many years, and way too few people are taking advantage of it. So one thing on here that I don't agree with, culture of fixing design issues over checkbox compliance. I addressed that one earlier. I'm not above checking the checkbox. There are scenarios and times and places where threat modeling doesn't make sense and we just need to check the checkbox. But in those scenarios, there are other ways, checklists and other approaches where you can do these exercises in an hour. I've got a good friend who is in medical device manufacturing, and he's got a threat modeling program that is for the checkbox style that is 1 hour and yet consistently turns up concerns and areas of improvement for security. That simple. So we should be afraid to check a checkbox with threat modeling. But at the same time, we should be able to do deeper, richer models that allow us to know where the bad guys are going. So with design, begin with empathy and then apply security flexibly along the path and do some pragmatic threat modeling. Figure out where people are going. Remember, good security enables users without enabling adversaries. That seems really simple, but every single time we add something, we are effectively giving a feature to a user and an exploit to an adversary. One of the textbook cases of that, fraud that's been going on for a little bit over maybe a year and a half now, maybe 2 years, is organizations that allow phone-based multi-factor. You sign up as a customer, they have the option to call you back to verify you are who you say you are. The feature is we want to make it very simple for customers to sign up. Awesome. And we want to make it secure for the customer to sign up. Awesome. And to do that, we're going to allow them to put in their phone number and get a call. Great. Every feature we add is an exploit to a user. Is an exploit to an adversary. So what ended up happening there was adversaries realized that these services were around, wrote some botnet code, find these services, register a few hundred, a few thousand, whatever scale they're at, customers, use 900 numbers, use multi-factor to call back to those 900 numbers, and then make a profit. So we need to remember that every time we're adding to the path, that not only is enabling the users, it's also enabling the adversaries. So we need to be very judicious about how we apply security. All right, so we did our requirements, we've done our design. Now we're going to implement, we're going to build the thing. We are going to build the product, whatever it may be. We're going to actually implement the right steps and services. And you'll hear something like, we need to secure the software development lifecycle, which I don't argue with, but there's some caveats to how that gets done. If you are DevOps, a DevOps shop, you're using a path that looks something like this, right? You're planning and coding and building and testing and releasing and repeating. What was fascinating to me about DevOps in the early days, I ran a DevOps team, early days DevOps, had a lot of fun doing it. And in the early days, we thought this is going to be great. Gene Kim came to security conferences and talked about the Phoenix project and what DevOps meant. Security people are like, awesome, we can use DevOps to do things faster and we can integrate security in. And then about a year goes by, 2 years goes by, and all these little DevOps projects poke up. And they're very fast. They're very nimble. They put stuff in right away. And so they start getting more and more attention. They start getting more and more resources. And what happens is half their speed is because they're not telling the security people or the audit people about it, right? Half their speed is simply keeping their head down and not following a full life cycle. And so in recent years, security has had to get involved and figure out how to fix these things. But then you call up security and you say, hey, will you fix my DevOps security problem? And you're like, no problem. I've got just the solution. All we need to do is do static analysis, inventory, code analysis, static analysis, and dynamic analysis, and source code analysis, code review, and design review, and vulnerability management, file integrity monitoring, change monitoring, container monitoring, cloud monitoring, put a WAF on and put a RASP on it, we'll be good. And the DevOps people never talk to you again. That's exactly how that conversation goes, because they're like, there's no way we could possibly take on all that. It's really important in security we remember, not only do we have limited time, not only do we have limited budget, but we also have a limit on what the organizations can take on in terms of change. So when we go with all these controls and we sit down with the developers and we try and figure these in, it's really important we phase them in a slow, steady way. And you got to keep that in mind before we go to them and say, look, oh, you know exactly what you need. You need an Iron Man suit. $1.5 billion and you'll be secure. The other thing to consider, and that you'll hear quite frequently, is developers don't care about security. I don't care. They don't know how to do it. They're not going to do it. And I push back on that. I've known some really savvy developers over the years, but I think part of the problem is we forget how developers are structured, right? Devs are incentivized for velocity. Change things. That's your incentive. Meanwhile, ops people are incentivized for stability. Don't change things unless you followed a change review process, and we're going to wrap you in ITIL processes to make sure nothing gets broke. And of course, security is incentivized for security. I mean, we're incentivized for making sure that the changes that occur don't create security loopholes. So there's already a mismatch there. The other thing is that we are outnumbered, right? There's probably 100 devs to every 10 ops people to every 1 security person. So our ability to directly hands-on impact change is limited. Our main way of going in and addressing this is to encourage security champions and the ops and the dev space. But we don't oftentimes do that, right? We think, well, they must be ignorant of the development. If only they knew what they're doing, they would do it right. Or we think, no, they're not ignorant. They're just irrational. They're not doing the right things because they don't understand why it means, what it matters. If I tell them a scary story, maybe they'll get it. If I share a Krebs article about people throwing rocks off of buildings that will carry the concrete umbrella, we think they're just irrational. These 2 of 4 barriers that are very common, not necessarily the right ones that I encourage you to use, but are very common. These 2 barriers are the barriers that you hear come up again and again and again from security teams that are not doing a good job at providing security to their environments. What you'll oftentimes hear for teams that are doing good is it's an investment problem. They need better tools. They need better ways of doing things. I've got a friend who is working on a software company, and it solves the developer need to document APIs. It does API enumeration, contracts at the YAML level, effectively make sure that what is coming out of the API is what we expect. If I expected $1, I get $1. If I expected a string, I get a string. If I expected a number, I don't have a SQL injection, right? Those sort of things, those sort of contractual things. And as a byproduct of that, as a result of that, greatly increases the security, because now you can't screw around with the API and do injection attacks and do all those sort of things. That's an investment. It's an investment that drives better devs, but it's also an investment that drives better security. And the other is incentives, like I already mentioned. We need to spend some time thinking about those incentives and how we can line them up. These are 4 barriers that get in the way of people doing security, but we almost always just default to, those devs, they don't care. Or you hear things like, we can't patch stupid. We don't need to patch stupid. We are outnumbered. We need to drop the ego. We need to take a team approach. Because in InfoSec, there's 1 of us to every 1,000 employees. to really truly be successful, we have to focus in not only on the technology side, but on the psychology side. So from a implementation perspective, we want to follow a life cycle, but we don't want to overburden that path, right? We don't want to slow it down. We need to consider more than, oh, they just don't know what they're doing. We need to consider incentives and investments and how to improve it. And I would argue this, that empathy is the heartbeat of good security at this stage. All right, so now we've had some requirements and design. Devs have built the thing. Now we're going to verify the thing. We're going to make sure the thing works, right? That it's the right thing. And we're going to run a pen test. Red teamers unite. You guys ever think about the first pen test? Something I spent some time on a sleepless night looking up. It was 1967, right? All you needed was love. The Beatles were #1. The summer of love was happening. Cars look like this. Computers look like that. And the RAND Corporation got 15,000 computer security experts together, 15,000 computer security experts, and a conference much like this. And they dared to ask the question, do you think all these computers and communication lines they're building could be broken into? And today we're like, well, yeah, duh. But that was the goal for the very first penetration test. Demonstrate the system can be breached, provide an attack scenario, identify weaknesses, and maybe scare up some money so we can make some improvements. First penetration test, these were the goals. It was actually carried out several years later in 1972 by James P. Anderson. James P. Anderson, I would argue, the OG of Red Team. You can look up his paper. It's very interesting because he's like, here's the attack scenario. And you think you're reading a modern pen test. And he's like, oh, and by the way, you need to make sure that you shred the punch cards. But some things have changed, some things haven't. So he is since retired. He's hard to find. But if you look up James P. Anderson off the UC Davis page, you can find his pen test report. What bothers me is that the goal for every subsequent pen test has been, can we demonstrate that we're being breached? Can you show me a attack scenario? And can you secure funding for improvements? Well, spoiler alert, yes. Yes, you can breach these things. Yes. If we hire a dedicated attacker, they're going to find a way around our controls. Yes, absolutely. If you got 10 ways into the system and you've locked down 7 of them, they're going to find those other 3 and break around. Yes, we know this. And I don't know why we keep thinking pen tests annually are going to somehow improve the security posture. They're important. Don't get me wrong. Love me a pen tester. But my God, we're going to wait to once a year to test our security, and then we're just going to hope that everything's working? I've often thought that security is not about castles or high walls or strong doors. I think security is about bells on strings. Bells on strings that when an attacker walks by, they ring. And when those bells ring, my SOC team gets involved, my incident response team gets involved. We isolate, we figure out what's going on, we investigate, we remediate, and we move forward. Bells on strings. Pen test is not necessarily going to tell me if my bells are ringing. They're not. They're not, right? This is where we need to do things that are different than an annual pen test. This is where we need to check on a much more continuous basis. I want to know monthly. I want to know weekly. I want to know every day that my controls are working. And I want to know every day that my controls are working. Why? Because a false sense of security is worse than no sense of security at all. And yet an annual pen test oftentimes will tell us that there's a problem, good, but won't tell us if we've got a false sense of security about what we think is working. So what we need to do, and the shift is already in place, is complement an annual pen test with adversary emulation, continuous control monitoring. We need to check arguably 4 things. Does the control even exist? Now you may be thinking, well, I really hope I don't have a control that I think exists that doesn't. That can't really happen. I was doing an assessment this one time, and everyone told me how great their network security system was. It was top of the line, had threat intel feeds to it, got very few false positives. They almost never had to worry about it, and it could see all traffic across the perimeter, and they were having everyone VPN back so that traffic could be checked. Sounded great, sounded awesome. Until I got to the networking team and I told them about this great control, and they laughed. And I went, uh-oh, why is this funny? Like, oh yeah, we know the plans you're talking about. They must not have listened. We unplugged that. Like, how long did you unplug it? They go, well, when we did the network refresh, which was about 18 months ago. I'm like, well, there's why you're not getting any false positives. There's why it's well-tuned, right? It's not well-tuned, it's not on. And I wish that was unusual, but we see this again and again, that we think we got a control that doesn't work. Or we think the control is effective, but it isn't. We think we've got a web application firewall that'll stop all bots. I was doing a CTF one time, and we put in place a WAF. It was an application CTF we were attacking back and forth. We put in place this WAF, and no one could get us. Yeah, this is awesome. As we start racking up points and reverse engineering things, and we're getting better and better and better. And one of my guys started mouthing off in the chat channel and said something to the effect of, come at me, bro, I've got a WAF. So pro tip, don't do that in a CTF. Within about a half hour, maybe less, WAF bypasses were crafted and they completely clobbered us. And we went from like a contender to like 20th, 50th, 100th. I think we came in 166th place. We got crushed. And if you think that only happened in the CTF, no. Oftentimes these controls are effective until somebody knows you have them and then works around them. So we want to test the effectiveness. We want to make sure they can't be circumvented, right? I've got this great control around my prod environment. I was actually just arguing this on Twitter the other day. All my data is in my prod environment. It's hardened. I've got least privilege everywhere. No one can get into it. It is glorious. Awesome. What about your non-prod? Oh, don't worry about that. What about your dev environment? Oh, don't worry about that. Does your dev environment have a copy of prod data? Suddenly the developers are no longer returning my calls. And sure enough, right? That's where you find it. You find no security in the dev environment. It's easy to circumvent. It's easy to get. Finally, are these controls actually operationalized? If that bell rings, does someone actually respond? Do they respond? They go and check in. So that's ways to improve pen testing. The other thing you may hear, right? Things we get wrong all the time. We have to be right every time. And the bad guys only have to be right once. I am judging anyone who says that. I'm just putting it out there right now, because anyone who's saying that is saying the following: we don't know the path the adversaries are going to take, right? We don't know where the bad guys are going. Or they're saying, you know, along the path the bad guys take, we don't know if our controls exist or are effective or operationalized or responded to, but we're just going to complain that we have to be right every time. If you got a good threat model and good controls along the path the adversaries take, the bad guys need to be right multiple times to bypass all that. And we need to be right a couple times to catch them. So for verification, recheck your threat models, check your attack surfaces, and move towards one or away from one-time tests. Don't give them up. Pen test is still important, but we want to check our controls every single time. Good security checks its basic assumptions while building on strength. All right, at this point in time, we've built a thing and it's up and it's running, it's glorious. And now we put it into production and life is good. And we're going to allow users on, which is where things get fun. We're first going to authenticate the users. Now, I'm not by any way, shape, or form saying don't authenticate the users. But I think we all can agree that passwords suck. And passwords have a long history of sucking. The very first password was on this computer, an IBM 7094. IBM 7094, this is where passwords were invented. Very shortly after that, this was in a university setting, very shortly after that, the students, 1962, in protest, printed out all the passwords and handed them around. So if you are frustrated at how people are requiring you to authenticate, just know that one of the very first events in cybersecurity history was people getting frustrated and printing out all the passwords. Shortly after that, 1966, a bug, I'm pretty sure this was done on purpose, a bug swapped the message of the day file with the master password. So when everyone logged in, conveniently you were offered up everyone's passwords. It's a mess. Password authentication is a mess. Now, you may think, cool. Passwordless is now a thing, right? We're not going to worry about this soon. People will be authenticating with FIDO2 authentication. We won't need a password. They'll use biometrics and everything. But before we get to that, there's an important aspect of the password story that I think bears sussing out. Whenever we're in security and we're taking action, we have two choices. We demand more of the machine, or we demand more of the person. When we demand more of the person, it's longer passwords, more complex passwords, unique passwords, rotated passwords, hundreds of passwords, all of them unique, 32 character. Please follow the NIST guidelines, rotate them every quarter. More of the people. When we ask more of the machine, it's better encryption, better storage, hashing, salting, right? And with passwordless, it is going to be removing the shared secret altogether. One of those paths introduces user friction. One of those paths annoys everybody. One of those paths is consistently the top way that people are phished and attacked. And it ain't the machine. When we think about passwordless, there's one other story I want to share here. The passwordless is already in place in a lot of different ways, right? Your phones, Windows Hello, those sort of things. Touch ID is one of the first ways that passwordless was around, where you could authenticate with the thumbprint. What was fascinating about that is before Touch ID, no one locked their phone. So almost no one. I mean, Apple's numbers were like 10 or 20%. Steve Jobs had a rant around, why would you lock your phone? Bicycles for the mind. Steve Jobs style rant. I was a CISO at the time, and I was pulling out my hair because I'm like, you need to run Blackberries unlocked on your phones. And users are like, just don't tell Wolf we got an iPhone. So Touch ID comes out 2015, and it fits clearly into the path people take, right? What do you do when you pick up your phone? You hit the home button every time. Pick up the home button. And it's secure by default. When you go ahead and set up your phone, it enrolls this. Within a year, lock screens jumped to over 80%. Why? Because it was easy, and because easy made it secure. So these are the types of thinking that we need to bring in when we are authenticating users and when we're really demanding anything of the user. The next thing I want to talk about is run a security awareness program. Your users are your weakest link. Oh my God, Dave is going to steal ours. As if security awareness really changes behavior. I don't know that it does. Again, maybe security is a special snowflake, unlike healthcare, driving, or elections. But historically, a security awareness program has not changed much at all, because awareness is not action, and people are just going to do what they want to do anyways. With elections, it was actually fascinating. They actually did a study of this. If you make someone aware of election, it doesn't change their voting behavior at all. But if you have them do a plan, if you have positive peer pressure, if you've got your identity wrapped up in one political party or movement or another, that's where you go out and vote. There's a great TED Talk on this, that if you just substitute election for security, speaks to exactly what we need to do and exactly what we've been doing wrong forever and a day about awareness. This gets back to that champion and advocate model I mentioned earlier. We need to understand what people care about and how to make their identity aligned with security. Now, they don't need to be security folks, but they're not going to do anything if it's just, oh, be aware of this. And likewise, we need to understand what some of the barriers and benefits are. Our job should be reducing barriers for users and amplifying benefits. Not always easy, right? Security doesn't always get a benefit. Like, oh yeah, look, we're here to have you do more things. You're welcome. You're welcome. It's hard to have a benefit, but some people have done this really well. I was working with an organization that did privileged access workstations. These workstations were super locked down, but reduced all the barriers around administration because they could get to everything. And the benefit was they were freaking cool, man. It was like top of the line gaming laptops with neon and everything. I mean, everything you think about a hacker, this was a hacker laptop, and this was the benefit. to enrolling in this secure way of doing privileged access. So think about that. Moving awareness to action really means reducing barriers and amplifying benefits. And then think about how we oftentimes do it. We make them aware, and then we're like, oh, we're going to fish you. That's how we prove our awareness. I hate fishes. I'm actually got my own little personal campaign to get rid of fish awareness. Why? Because my organization used to threaten people that if they didn't log in, they're going to lose their time off. It was a great way to get passwords. It's a terrible way to get passwords. We saw in the beginning of this year a healthcare system, frontline healthcare workers, get told that they could get a COVID vaccine, and that was used against them to steal their passwords. We've seen people told that they're going to get a bonus. We've seen people told they're going to lose a job. This constant tricking of people, this constant threatening them, their needs, not thinking about their safety, this constant approach has not helped security. I argue that kindness is the original security control. It's not sexy, it's not technical, but every other control builds upon the relationships we have with people. And if we don't have kindness in place, nothing else gets done because there's more of them than there are of us. If you're wondering why users don't listen to security, we did this. We did this to ourselves, and we keep doing it with phishing exercises and tone-deaf security awareness. So from an operations perspective, try to place the burden on the machine, not the person, and encourage action over awareness. Good security is usable security. Good security is adopted security. Good security is kind security. So in conclusion, we have built the thing, right? We covered some requirements, we designed something, we implemented it, we got users on it. Life is good. And when along the way, I talked about a lot of ways that we get things wrong. And one of the ways is just as a people thing, we tend to get stuck in the thinginess of things. And what I mean by that is, well, I said passwordless authentication earlier. And you notice we're defining that in terms of what it was, right? It was a password, now it's passwordless. There's the new name for it. But does that really allow us to think about the creative implications of things? I don't know that it does. If you were to go back like 100 years, right? 100 years in Michigan, look at State of the Tech. State of the Tech was all about transportation. What's interesting is what they're calling it. They're calling it the horseless carriage. It's a carriage without a horse. What else are you going to call it? Some of the earlier cars actually had horse heads in front to make people feel more comfortable. And you may be thinking, that's ridiculous. Those silly people. We've learned so much in 100 years. But what are we doing right now in transportation technology? We're all excited about the driverless car. We really get stuck on how things look and how we think they should be. Now, I've been writing a series of articles. I'm going to write 100 tips on security design based on other fields. And I want to share 3 with you because I think that really highlights what I'm talking about. One is the radio, the Echo 8065. Around the same time we were doing horseless carriages, radios and music looked like furniture. It was heavy. This is a picture of the Brunswick phonograph. I actually have one of these, or I did until my last move. It didn't make the move, but heavy pieces of equipment. Guy came out named Will Coates. It's like, that's ridiculous. We need something smaller. We need something simpler. He came up with this 8065. Doesn't look anything like what had come before. As a matter of fact, to make it to scale, it really looked more like this. It was a huge jump forward. And he wasn't a radio guy or musician. He just looked at the problem differently. Similarly, sewing machines, 100 freaking years, Singer ran sewing machines. They were heavy, again, pieces of furniture, wrought iron, not easy to use. An Italian designer who had expertise in clothing and sewing came up with the Morella sewing machine you see here. Highly ergonomic, didn't look anything like anything that had come before. Very easy to use, very user-friendly, and still prized today. Antique collectors are still using these machines today. The iMac. I cannot explain to you how excited and mind-blowing it was to unbox my first iMac by Johnny Ives, of course, Steve Jobs. I've still got the posters in my study. I'm gesturing like you can see over here. But it just, at the time, I was building white box computers and all computers looked like what was on the left. How did he see this? How do these people see these things differently? How do you go from a piece of furniture to a nice, slick, round radio? How do you go from a gray box to this industrial piece of art? How do you do that? I do not know. I don't know. And if anyone does know, I would love to know. But I would say if you're thinking about heavy, if you're thinking about expensive, if you're thinking about boxy, if you're thinking about clunky, look no further than cybersecurity. This is cybersecurity today. This is what we deal with. This space is ripe for the next Johnny Ives. This space is ripe for the next Swell Coates. This space needs to be radically overhauled and radically rethought. So I'm glad you're at this conference today. I'm glad you joined my session. I hope you're giving this some thought. And along the way, I shared what we're getting wrong, and we're going to continue to get things wrong. So what? Go get some things wrong, right? Go get them wrong in new ways. Go get them wrong in ways that we haven't thought about. Go look at the buildings and ask about the corners. Go shake things up, because this industry absolutely needs it. Needs it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Wolf. It really seems like we have a lot to go and a lot wrong that we need to fix.
Always.
And so, what were you thinking as far as password authentication? I know you're talking about checking the box and all of that. So where do you think we draw the line there?
Which aspect of it?
As far as I know, I mentioned password list, but I really meant multi-factor and all those different steps. Where do you think we draw the line there?
Yeah, I think that what we need to look at is what's the value of people's time, what are people trying to accomplish, and how likely are the adversaries to try and work around us. And then we need to figure out how can we reduce the burden of doing the job. Now, we do need good controls. We know people are trying to steal accounts all the time, right? It's not going to stop happening. But at the same time, we don't need to make it so complex. I was doing consulting, and I had to carry physical hard tokens, and the VPN client kept crashing, and it didn't work on my laptop. And it wasn't secure. I mean, it was secure in that it checked all the boxes, but the result was my team got aggravated and just simply copied all the data out. And so in those types of scenarios, you create a set of constraints that drives user behavior that actually decreases security.
Interesting. Huh. Yeah. Someone put in the chat, thank you for talking about simplifying security measures and speaking to the user in simple terms. And I think you definitely did break it down real well for us. So thank you for that talk, Wolf.
Great. Yeah, no, my pleasure. And thanks again for having me.